The rain fell in sheets across the desolate Wyoming landscape, drenching the lone figure huddled beneath the meager shelter of a lightning-struck cottonwood. Zoey Jameson clutched her wailing infant tighter to her chest, her threadbare shawl doing little to protect either of them from the relentless downpour. It was 1875, and the promise of a new life in Dillon had turned to bitter disappointment and abandonment. "Hush now, Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Everything will be all right." The lie tasted sour on her tongue. Nothing had been all right since her husband had disappeared 3 weeks ago with their savings, leaving her with nothing but a 3-month-old baby and crushing desperation. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the drumming rain. Zoey stiffened, pressing herself against the rough bark of the tree. Travelers on this road could mean many things, few of them good for a woman alone. A tall silhouette emerged from the curtain of rain, the broad brim of a hat partially shielding a weather-beaten face. The rider pulled his horse to a stop, water cascading off his oilskin duster as he surveyed the pitiful scene before him. "Madam," the voice was deep, cautious. "You all right out here?" "We're fine," Zoey called back, her arms tightening instinctively around her crying child. "Just waiting for the storm to pass." The stranger dismounted, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the muddy ground. As he approached, Zoey could see him more clearly, tall and broad-shouldered, with a sun-darkened face and eyes the color of a summer sky. He couldn't be much older than her 23 years, but something in his gaze spoke of hard-earned wisdom. "Name's Xavier Quinn," he said, keeping a respectful distance. "That little one doesn't sound too happy." "He's just hungry and cold," Zoey admitted, her voice cracking despite her efforts to appear strong. Xavier Quinn looked from the mother to the child, then scanned the surrounding area. "Where's your husband, madam?" "Gone," she said flatly. 3 weeks now." Understanding dawned in the cowboy's eyes. He removed his hat, rain immediately plastering his dark hair to his forehead. "Night's coming. Storm's getting worse. My ranch is about 3 miles east of here. It ain't much, but it's dry." When Zoey hesitated, he stepped closer. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the baby. Something in his gentle tone made her relent. She watched as Xavier carefully took the child from her arms, cradling him with surprising tenderness for hands so clearly accustomed to rough work. Thomas's cries quieted almost immediately as Xavier tucked him securely inside his duster, sheltering him from the rain. Looking down at the tiny face, then back to the exhausted mother, the cowboy made a decision that would alter all their lives. "We stay," he said firmly. "At least until you're both back on your feet. No arguing now, let's get you both somewhere warm and dry." Too tired to protest, Zoey allowed him to help her onto his horse before mounting behind her, one arm securely around her waist as he held the reins, the other cradling her child against his chest. As the horse trudged through the muddy terrain toward Xavier's ranch, Zoey felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. She had learned the hard way that men weren't to be trusted, yet something about this stranger's quiet strength gave her pause. Perhaps it was desperation, perhaps providence, but for now, she would accept his help if only for her son's sake. The rain continued to fall as they rode east, washing away their tracks and the life Zoey was leaving behind. Xavier's ranch was indeed modest, a small 2-room cabin with a lean-to stable for his horses and a weathered barn, but after hours in the rain, it looked like paradise to Zoey. A curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. "My foreman must have kept the fire going," Xavier explained as he helped her down from the horse. "Old Pete's a good man, but he don't live here. Has a place in town with his sister." Still holding Thomas protectively inside his coat, Xavier led Zoey to the cabin door. The interior was simple but clean, a main room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table with 3 chairs, and a rocking chair positioned near the hearth. A doorway led to what Zoey presumed was a bedroom. "It's not much," Xavier said, almost apologetically as he gently handed Thomas back to her. "It's wonderful," Zoey replied honestly, moving closer to the blessed heat of the fire. For the first time in hours, she could feel her fingertips again. Xavier moved with efficient purpose, hanging his drenched coat and hat by the door before stoking the fire. "You should get out of those wet clothes," he said, his back to her. "I'll find something you can wear while they dry." He disappeared into the bedroom, returning moments later with a clean flannel shirt and a pair of trousers that would clearly be too large for her slight frame. These will have to do for now. There's a screen in the corner you can change behind. I'll see what I can rustle up for supper while you get settled. Zoey hesitated, clutching her baby to her chest. Reading her uncertainty, Xavier smiled faintly. I'll step outside to check on my horse. Take your time. Once alone, Zoey changed quickly, rolling up the sleeves and pant legs of the borrowed clothing. The dry fabric felt heavenly against her chilled skin. Thomas had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from crying, and she placed him carefully on the bed, creating a makeshift barrier of pillows to keep him from rolling. When Xavier returned, he carried a pail of fresh milk and some eggs. Pete's sister sends these over, he explained. Thought the little one might need milk, though I reckon it's not exactly what he's used to. I thank you, Zoey said, suddenly overwhelmed by this stranger's kindness. Why are you helping us? Xavier busied himself with preparing a simple meal, cracking eggs into a cast-iron pan. Madam Zoey, she interjected. Zoey Jameson. Miss Zoey, he acknowledged with a slight nod. Out here, folks help each other. It's how we survive. He paused, focusing intently on stirring the eggs. I've been alone on this ranch a long while. Wouldn't be Christian to leave a woman and baby out in that storm. As they ate the simple meal of scrambled eggs and pan bread, Zoey gradually shared her story, how she'd married Thomas Jameson Sr. with high hopes, only to discover his penchant for gambling and drink. How they'd come west from Illinois after he'd run up debts, promising a fresh start. How he'd left her in a rented room in Dillon while he went to seek opportunities, only to disappear entirely. The landlady gave me 3 days to pay or leave, she concluded, her voice hollow. I was trying to reach the next town when the storm hit. Xavier listened quietly, his blue eyes thoughtful. Dillon's a hard town for a woman alone, he finally said. But honest work isn't impossible to find. Once the weather clears, I can take you back if that's your wish. Thomas began to fuss, and Zoey rose to tend to him, diluting some of the fresh milk with water as she'd seen other mothers do when they couldn't nurse. Or, Xavier added, watching her care for the child, you could stay on here a spell. I've been meaning to hire help around the place. Pete's getting on in years, and there's more work than 2 men can handle. I don't know the first thing about ranching, Zoey admitted. You know about keeping house, I imagine? Cooking? Mending? When she nodded, he continued, that would be help enough. There's the extra room. Pete's sister fixed it up nice when she thought he might stay on, but he prefers town. You and the boy could have it. Proper wages, too. Why would you offer that to a stranger? Xavier's weathered face softened slightly. Maybe I'm tired of coming home to an empty house. Maybe I need the help. Or maybe, he added quietly, I know what it's like to be left with nothing and nowhere to go. Zoey studied him, searching for signs of deception or ulterior motives, but found only open honesty in his gaze. Just until I can find something more suitable, she said finally. And I insist on working for my keep. Xavier nodded once, as if sealing a business arrangement. Fair enough. We'll see how it goes. That night, as Zoey settled into the small but clean second bedroom with Thomas sleeping peacefully beside her, she marveled at the strange turn her life had taken in a single day. The rain continued to drum against the roof, but for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. In the main room, Xavier Quinn sat in the rocking chair by the fire, wondering what kind of man would abandon a woman like Zoey and a child as perfect as little Thomas. It was a question that would haunt him in the days to come, even as he told himself that their arrangement was temporary and practical, nothing more. But as the storm raged outside and peace reigned within the small cabin, something fundamental had already shifted in the universe of possibilities that surrounded them all. The following days established a rhythm to their unusual arrangement. Zoey proved herself capable and hardworking, transforming the sparse cabin into something resembling a home. She rose early each morning to prepare breakfast before Xavier headed out to work the ranch, then spent her days cleaning, mending, and caring for Thomas. Xavier returned each evening to hot meals and clean clothes, simple luxuries he hadn't enjoyed since leaving his family's home in Missouri 10 years earlier. At first, their interactions were polite but reserved, each careful not to overstep the boundaries of their arrangement. By the end of the first week, however, a fragile friendship had begun to form. Xavier found himself lingering at the table after meals, listening to Zoey hum to Thomas as she washed the dishes or tell stories of her childhood in Illinois. For her part, Zoey discovered that behind the cowboy's quiet demeanor lay a thoughtful mind and dry wit that occasionally surprised a laugh from her. "How did you come to own this ranch?" she asked one evening as they sat before the fire. Thomas, sleeping contentedly in a cradle Xavier had unexpectedly produced from the barn, explaining gruffly that he'd been practicing his carpentry. Xavier stretched his long legs toward the hearth, considering the question. Worked for the previous owner, Old Man Hargrove, for 5 years. Started as a hand, worked up to foreman. When his health failed and his children showed no interest in ranching, he offered to sell it to me. A faint smile touched his lips. I had almost no money, but he set a fair price and let me pay in installments. Last payment was made just before he passed, 3 years back. That was generous of him. He was a good man. Taught me everything I know about cattle and horses. Xavier's gaze grew distant. Said I reminded him of his son who died in the war. And your family? Are they still in Missouri? A shadow crossed his face. Pa died when I was 16. Ma remarried a year later a man who made it clear he had no use for another man's son. Left the next day, worked my way west. I'm sorry, Zoey said softly. Xavier shrugged, uncomfortable with sympathy. Worked out for the best. I've done all right for myself. Yes, you have, she agreed, looking around the simple but comfortable cabin. Though this place could use a woman's touch, she added with a small smile. Been saying that to myself for years, Xavier admitted, his eyes meeting hers across the room. Something in his gaze made Zoey's heart beat faster. She busied herself with adjusting Thomas's blanket, trying to ignore the warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. I should turn in, she said, rising from her chair. Morning comes early. That it does, Xavier agreed, his voice low. Good night, Zoey. Good night, Xavier. As April turned to May, the Wyoming countryside burst into brief, spectacular bloom. Zoey often took Thomas outside during the mild afternoons, spreading a blanket beneath the shade of the cottonwoods that lined the small creek running through Xavier's property. The baby was thriving, growing stronger each day, his sunny disposition winning the heart of even old Pete, who would make special trips from town just to dandle the child on his knee. Xavier found himself inventing reasons to return to the cabin during the day, a forgotten tool, a message for Pete, a sudden thirst that only water from the kitchen pump would quench. Each time, he would spend a few moments watching Zoey with Thomas, marveling at the natural grace with which she moved through motherhood despite her youth and difficult circumstances. One afternoon, he returned to find her hanging laundry in the yard, singing softly to Thomas who lay gurgling on his blanket nearby. The sight stopped Xavier in his tracks, her hair gleaming copper in the sunlight. The simple domestic tableau somehow transforming his humble ranch into something he'd never dared hope for, a home. Zoey looked up, catching him watching her. You're back early, she observed, pinning one of his shirts to the line. Finished mending the north fence faster than expected, he explained, dismounting. Thought I might take a look at that loose shutter on your bedroom window before the next storm. She smiled, and Xavier felt something twist pleasantly in his chest. That would be wonderful. It kept me awake half the night during the last windstorm. Can't have that, he replied, more gruffly than he intended. You need your rest. As he worked on the shutter, Xavier found himself wondering how much longer this arrangement would last. Zoey had mentioned finding something more suitable when she first agreed to stay, but she'd made no move to leave in the weeks since. He'd begun to hope foolishly, perhaps that she might consider staying permanently. The thought both exhilarated and terrified him. At 32, Xavier had long ago resigned himself to bachelorhood, focusing his energy on building his ranch rather than seeking a wife. Women were scarce in this part of Wyoming, and those few who were unmarried showed little interest in a man who spent most of his days covered in dust and smelling of cattle. But Zoey was different. Despite her difficult past, she approached life with a quiet determination that resonated with something deep inside him. And then there was Thomas, a child he had no claim to, yet increasingly thought of as his own. Later that evening, after Zoey had put Thomas to bed, Xavier cleared his throat awkwardly as they sat at the table finishing the apple cobbler she'd made for dessert. Been meaning to ride into town tomorrow, he said. Need supplies, and thought you might want to come along. You and Thomas, he added hastily. Zoe's expression clouded slightly. I'm not sure that's a good idea. If my husband is still in the area. All the more reason to go, Xavier pointed out. You should know if he's around, and folks in town should know you're under my protection now. Her eyebrows rose. Your protection? Xavier shifted uncomfortably. That came out wrong. I just meant, well, a woman living on a man's property without being kin. Tongues will wag. Best to be upfront about the arrangement, show there's nothing improper going on. And what exactly is our arrangement, Xavier? Zoe asked quietly. Am I your housekeeper? Your friend? What would you tell the people of Dillon? The question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. I'd tell them you're a respectable widow working for fair wages, he said finally. No need to mention your husband might still be alive. Simpler that way. Zoe considered this, her fingers tracing the pattern on her plate. A widow, she repeated slowly. Yes, I suppose in many ways, that's what I am. Thomas Sr. is dead to me, even if he still draws breath somewhere. Then it's settled, Xavier said, relieved. We'll leave after breakfast. Town's not far, should be there by mid-morning if we take the wagon. The trip to Dillon the next day proved more eventful than either had anticipated. The small frontier town was bustling with activity. A cattle drive had just passed through, leaving the saloons full and the streets lively with cowboys spending their pay. Xavier helped Zoe down from the wagon in front of the general store, conscious of the curious glances they received. Thomas, secured in a sling Zoe had fashioned across her chest, regarded the new surroundings with wide-eyed wonder. Mr. Quinn, called a cheerful voice. A plump, gray-haired woman emerged from the mercantile, her kind face lighting up at the sight of them. And who might these folks be? Mrs. Hollis. Xavier greeted her with a respectful nod. This is Mrs. Jameson and her son Thomas. She's been keeping house at the ranch these past weeks. Mrs. Hollis's eyes twinkled knowingly. Is that so? Well, it's about time you had a woman's influence out there. Place was becoming positively Spartan last I heard. It's not like that, madam, Zoe interjected quickly. I'm a widow in need of work, and Mr. Quinn kindly offered me employment. Of course, dear, Mrs. Hollis said, though her smile suggested she had her own thoughts on the matter. Well, come in, come in. I just got a shipment of fabric from back east that you simply must see. As Mrs. Hollis led Zoe into the store, chattering about the latest gossip, Xavier found himself cornered by several acquaintances, all suddenly interested in his domestic arrangements. Never thought I'd see the day, chuckled Sam Porter, owner of the livery stable. Xavier Quinn with a pretty young thing and a baby, no less. You work fast, Quinn. It's not like that, Xavier insisted, echoing Zoe's words. She's in a difficult situation, and I'm helping out. Nothing more. If you say so, Sam replied skeptically. Though I can't blame you, she's a beauty. Where'd you find her? On the road during that big storm last month, Xavier explained, keeping his voice low. Her husband abandoned her, and she had nowhere to go. Sam's expression sobered. Abandoned, you say? Not. He dragged a finger across his throat in a meaningful gesture. No, just left her. Name's Thomas Jameson. Ever heard of him? Sam shook his head. Can't say I have, but I can ask around. Lot of drifters come through Dillon. I'd appreciate that, Xavier said. Just to know if he's still in the area. For her safety, he added hastily. Sam's knowing grin returned. Sure. For her safety. Inside the mercantile, Zoe was experiencing a similar interrogation, albeit more gently delivered, from Mrs. Hollis and two other ladies who had materialized from the dress goods section. A widow at your age, poor dear, clucked Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife. And with such a young child. Yes, it's been difficult, Zoe replied carefully. Mr. Quinn has been very kind. I'll bet he has, murmured Mrs. Davis, the younger of the women. Never thought I'd see the day Xavier Quinn took in strays. Man's been married to that ranch of his for years. We have a purely professional relationship, Zoe insisted, feeling her cheeks warm. Mrs. Hollis patted her hand. Of course, dear. Though I must say, I've known Xavier since he first came to Dillon, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Before Zoe could respond, the bell above the store door jangled, and a hush fell over the gossiping women. Zoe turned to see a tall, elegantly dressed man enter, his expensive suit and gold watch chain marking him as someone of means. Ladies, he greeted them with an exaggerated bow. Brightening up old Hollis's store, I see. Mr. Blackstone, Mrs. Hollis acknowledged, her friendly demeanor noticeably cooled. What brings you to my humble establishment? Business in town, he replied vaguely, his attention already shifting to Zoey. And who might this vision be? This is Mrs. Jameson, Mrs. Peterson said when Zoey remained silent. She's staying at Xavier Quinn's ranch. Something flickered in the man's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or calculation. Is she indeed? How fascinating. He extended a hand to Zoey. Victor Blackstone, at your service, madam. I own the Silver Dollar Saloon and several other enterprises in town. Zoey reluctantly accepted his handshake, disliking the way his eyes lingered on her. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Blackstone. The pleasure is entirely mine, he replied, his gaze dropping to Thomas. And who is this fine young man? My son, Zoey said shortly, instinctively pulling Thomas closer. Charming, Blackstone murmured, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. Well, I must be going. I do hope we'll meet again, Mrs. Jameson. With a tip of his hat, he departed, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Stay clear of that one, Mrs. Hollis advised in a low voice once he was gone. Victor Blackstone has his fingers in every crooked deal in the county. They say he's ruined more men through cards and loans than the drought of '68. Zoey nodded, suddenly eager to find Xavier and return to the safety of the ranch. Something about Blackstone had unsettled her deeply, though she couldn't quite name why. Outside, Xavier was loading supplies into the wagon when he spotted Victor Blackstone exiting the mercantile. The saloon owner caught his eye and sauntered over, twirling his walking stick with affected nonchalance. Quinn, he greeted. Heard you've acquired some new assets recently. Xavier's jaw tightened. Mrs. Jameson works for me, Blackstone. That's all. Of course, Blackstone said smoothly. Though I must say, you've always had a keen eye for value. She's quite exquisite. Watch your mouth, Xavier warned, his voice dropping dangerously. Blackstone held up his hands in mock surrender. No offense intended, merely an observation between gentlemen. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Though I wonder, does she know about your past? The real reason you left Missouri? Xavier stiffened, his hands clenching into fists. That's ancient history, and none of your concern. Perhaps not, Blackstone agreed with a shrug. But secrets have a way of surfacing at the most inopportune moments. With a tip of his hat, he strolled away, leaving Xavier staring after him with a mixture of anger and unease. The trip back to the ranch was subdued, both Zoey and Xavier lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until they were almost home that Zoey broke the silence. That man, Blackstone, who is he really? Xavier's hands tightened on the reins. A snake in fancy boots. Owns half the businesses in Dillon, most of them not entirely legal. Best to stay clear of him. He seemed to know you, Zoey observed carefully. We've had dealings, Xavier admitted reluctantly. None pleasant. He made me uncomfortable, Zoey confessed. The way he looked at Thomas and me. Xavier's expression hardened. You don't need to worry about him. I won't let him near you or the boy. The fierce protectiveness in his voice warmed something inside Zoey, even as she wondered what history lay between the two men. There was clearly more to Xavier Quinn than he had revealed, but then again, she had her own secrets too. As the wagon crested the final hill and Xavier's modest ranch came into view, Zoey was surprised by the wave of relief that washed over her. In just a few short weeks, this place had begun to feel like home in a way no place had since she'd left her parents' house to marry Thomas Sr. Xavier, she said softly as he helped her down from the wagon, Thomas sleeping peacefully against her chest. Thank you for today. For everything, really. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them seemed charged with possibility. Xavier's hand lingered on her waist, steadying her though she no longer needed the support. Zoey, he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. Yes, she prompted, her heart suddenly racing. The moment shattered as Thomas awoke with a hungry cry. Xavier stepped back, releasing her and turning to unload the supplies. Best get him inside, he said gruffly. I'll take care of the wagon. Zoey nodded, swallowing her disappointment as she headed toward the cabin. Whatever Xavier had been about to say would remain unspoken for now. The weeks following their trip to Dillon brought changes to the ranch and its inhabitants. With the money Xavier had paid her, Zoe purchased fabric to make new curtains and a quilt for her bed, adding touches of color to the formerly austere cabin. She also bought a second-hand dress for herself, tired of wearing the men's clothing Xavier had loaned her, altered though it was to fit her frame. Xavier, for his part, seemed to be making improvements of his own. He built a proper crib for Thomas to replace the makeshift cradle, crafting it from pine with careful attention to detail. He also began clearing a patch of ground near the cabin for what he called a kitchen garden. "My ma always had one," he explained as he turned the soil one evening after supper. "Said store-bought vegetables couldn't compare to homegrown." She was right, Zoe agreed, watching him work while Thomas played on a blanket nearby. "My mother's garden was her pride and joy. I'd love to grow some herbs and vegetables here." "Then it's yours," Xavier said simply, driving his shovel into the earth with renewed vigor. "Plant whatever you like." The simple statement, "it's yours," lingered in Zoe's mind that night as she lay in bed. What exactly was hers here? The garden spot, certainly. The room she slept in, at least temporarily. But what of her growing feelings for the quiet, honorable man who had taken them in? Those feelings had become impossible to ignore, though she tried. Each morning when Xavier came in for breakfast, hair still damp from washing at the pump, the sight of him made her pulse quicken. Each evening as they sat companionably by the fire, she found herself studying his profile, admiring the strong line of his jaw, the surprising gentleness of his hands as he whittled toys for Thomas. But did he feel the same? Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch, but he never spoke of anything beyond their current arrangement. Perhaps he was simply a kind man helping those in need, with no deeper feelings involved. Or perhaps, like her, he was afraid. Afraid of rejection, afraid of complication, afraid of the happiness that seemed almost within reach. June arrived with a burst of summer heat and the promise of a good season for the ranch. Xavier's small herd of cattle were healthy, the spring calves growing strong. He had also taken on breeding and training horses, and had 3 promising young colts in the corral near the barn. One sweltering afternoon, Zoe was hanging laundry when she heard an unfamiliar wagon approaching. Shielding her eyes from the sun, she saw a dust cloud rising from the road, accompanied by the sound of voices. Xavier emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Expecting anyone?" Zoe called to him. "No," he replied, frowning. "Take Thomas and go inside, just in case." Zoe quickly gathered the baby and retreated to the cabin, watching through the window as the wagon drew closer. To her relief, she soon recognized Mrs. Hollis seated beside a young man who appeared to be in his late teens. Xavier's posture relaxed as well, and he strode forward to greet them as the wagon pulled up to the hitching post. "Mrs. Hollis," he called, "this is an unexpected pleasure." "Xavier Quinn, you'll never believe the news," the older woman exclaimed as the young man helped her down from the wagon. "This is my nephew, Joseph, just arrived from Denver with the most extraordinary information." Curious, Zoe stepped onto the porch, Thomas on her hip. Mrs. Hollis waved excitedly. "Mrs. Jameson, come down here, dear. This concerns you most particularly." With a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, Zoe descended the porch steps to join them. "Joseph here works for the Rocky Mountain Detective Agency," Mrs. Hollis explained breathlessly. "He's been tracking a swindler across 3 states. And this concerns me how?" Zoe asked, glancing uncertainly at Xavier. The young man stepped forward, removing his hat. "Madam, would your husband's full name be Thomas James Jameson, formerly of Springfield, Illinois?" Zoe felt the blood drain from her face. "Yes," she whispered. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news," Joseph said gently. "Mr. Jameson was found dead in Denver 2 weeks ago, shot in a gambling dispute." The world seemed to tilt beneath Zoe's feet. Xavier was immediately at her side, his hand steadying her elbow. "Are you certain?" she managed to ask. Joseph nodded solemnly. "Quite certain, madam. He had your wedding photograph in his pocket, along with some letters bearing your name. The Denver authorities asked our agency to locate his next of kin." "I see," Zoe said faintly. "There's more," Mrs. Hollis interjected. "Tell her the rest, Joseph." The young detective cleared his throat. "It seems Mr. Jameson was wanted in connection with several confidence schemes in Illinois and Missouri. He apparently had a pattern of marrying vulnerable young women, gaining control of their assets, then disappearing. Vulnerable young women, Zoey repeated hollowly. Yes, that would describe me perfectly. My parents had just died, leaving me their farm and savings. Thomas was very attentive during my mourning period. Xavier's hand tightened on her arm. Let's go inside, he suggested quietly. Mrs. Hollis, Mr. Hollis, would you join us for coffee? Once seated at the kitchen table, with Thomas contentedly playing on a blanket nearby, Joseph Hollis continued his explanation. We believe you were at least his third wife, Mrs. Jameson. There may be others we haven't identified yet. The good news, he added, is that some of his stolen money was recovered in Denver. As his legal widow, you're entitled to it once the necessary paperwork is completed. How much? Xavier asked bluntly. Nearly $2,000, Joseph replied. Not a fortune, but enough to give Mrs. Jameson a fresh start. $2,000. The sum echoed in Zoe's mind. Enough to buy a small house in town. Enough to support herself and Thomas for several years if she was careful. Enough for true independence. I don't know what to say, she murmured. Say you'll come stay with me in town until everything's settled, Mrs. Hollis suggested eagerly. I have plenty of room, and it would be such a comfort to have a young person about the house again. Zoe looked at Xavier, but his expression had become unreadable, his jaw tight as he stared into his coffee cup. That's very kind, she began hesitantly. But you should consider it, Xavier interrupted, his voice carefully neutral. Being in town would make the legal proceedings easier. And as Mrs. Hollis says, you'd have company. I don't need to decide immediately, do I? Zoe asked, feeling strangely panicked at the thought of leaving the ranch, of leaving Xavier. Of course not, dear, Mrs. Hollis assured her. The offer stands whenever you're ready. Joseph will be in the area for at least 2 weeks sorting out the details. After the visitors departed, promising to return in a few days with the necessary documents, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Xavier busied himself stoking the fire, though the summer evening was warm enough without it. So, he said finally, still not looking at her. You're a wealthy woman now. Hardly wealthy, Zoe countered. But yes, it seems I'll have some means of my own. She hesitated, then added softly. It changes nothing about our arrangement, Xavier. Not unless you want it to. Now he did look at her, his blue eyes turbulent with emotions she couldn't quite decipher. Don't be foolish, Zoe. Of course it changes things. You're free, now truly free. No need to hide. No need to work as another man's housekeeper. You can start fresh, give Thomas the life he deserves. And what if the life I want for Thomas for both of us is here? She asked, her heart pounding. Xavier's expression softened momentarily, then hardened again as he turned away. You don't know what you're saying. The excitement of the news has you confused. I'm not confused, Zoe insisted, frustration building inside her. Xavier, look at me. Please. Reluctantly, he faced her again. These past months have been the happiest of my life, she said simply. Despite everything being abandoned, being alone with a child, being penniless, I've found happiness here. With you. Xavier closed his eyes briefly, as if in pain. Zoe, there are things you don't know about me. Things that might change how you feel. Then tell me, she challenged. Whatever it is, it can't be worse than what I've already survived. He shook his head. Not tonight. You've had enough shocks for one day. Moving toward the door, he added, I need to check on the new colt. Don't wait up. As the door closed behind him, Zoe sank into a chair, fighting back tears of frustration. Just when a future with Xavier seemed possible, she was free, financially secure, no longer tied to a man who had never truly loved her. He was pulling away. Whatever secrets Xavier Quinn harbored, she was determined to uncover them. Not just for her own sake, but for Thomas's future and for the taciturn cowboy who had saved them both from the rain and, in doing so, had claimed her heart completely. The next morning, Zoe awoke to find Xavier already gone, his bed unslept in. Concern gnawing at her, she bundled Thomas into his sling and walked to the barn, where she found old Pete brushing down one of the horses. Morning, Mrs. Jameson, he greeted her cheerfully. Fine day, ain't it? Yes, lovely, she agreed distractedly. Pete, have you seen Xavier this morning? The old man nodded. Rode out before dawn. Said he had business in town, might not be back till nightfall. I see, Zoe said, trying to mask her disappointment. Did he seem All right to you. Pete considered this, leaning on his brush. Can't rightly say. Boss has always been a man of few words, especially when something's troubling him. He studied her face. Heard about your husband and the inheritance. Congratulations are in order, I reckon. Thank you, she replied automatically. Pete, how long have you known Xavier? Going on 8 years now. Was working for Old Man Hargrove when Xavier first showed up looking for work. Quiet fellow, but a hard worker and good with the animals. Honest, too. Never known him to cheat a man or break his word. Do you know anything about his life before he came here? In Missouri. Pete shook his head. Not much. He don't talk about it, and I don't pry. Man's entitled to his privacy. Zoey nodded, thanking him before returning to the cabin. Whatever Xavier was hiding, it seemed he'd kept it close for many years. The question was, why had he chosen now to distance himself? Was it truly concern that his past would change her feelings for him, or was it something else entirely? Perhaps, she thought with a sinking heart, he simply didn't return her feelings and was using this inheritance as an excuse to end their arrangement gracefully. The thought hurt more than she cared to admit. As promised, Xavier didn't return until well after sundown. Zoey had kept his dinner warm by the fire, but when she heard his horse approach, she remained in her bedroom, suddenly unsure of what to say to him. She listened as he entered quietly, moving around the kitchen before his footsteps retreated to his bedroom. Only when the cabin was silent did she emerge, finding a folded note on the table addressed to her in Xavier's angular handwriting. Zoey, it read, I've arranged for you to meet with the bank manager tomorrow at 10 o'clock regarding your inheritance. Mrs. Hollis has offered to watch Thomas while you attend to the business. I'll drive you to town in the morning. Xavier. The formality of the note stung. No mention of their conversation the previous night, no personal touch at all. Just practical arrangements, as if she were indeed merely his housekeeper. Sleep eluded her that night as she turned the situation over in her mind. By morning, she had made a decision. She would go to town, meet with the bank manager as arranged, but she would also make inquiries about Xavier Quinn. Someone in Dillon must know his story. The ride to town was painfully quiet. Xavier drove the wagon with rigid concentration, responding to her attempts at conversation with monosyllables. When they arrived at Mrs. Hollis's neat home at the edge of town, he helped her down from the wagon with careful courtesy. I have errands to run, he said stiffly. I'll return at 4 o'clock to take you back to the ranch. Xavier, wait, Zoey said, catching his sleeve as he turned to leave. Whatever is troubling you, whatever you think I should know, it won't change how I feel. Please believe that. Something flickered in his eyes, hope, perhaps, or regret before his expression closed again. We'll talk tonight, he promised, after you've had time to consider your options. With that, he climbed back into the wagon and drove away, leaving Zoey staring after him in frustration. Mrs. Hollis welcomed her warmly, cooing over Thomas and assuring Zoey that the baby would be perfectly content with her while Zoey attended to her banking business. And when you return, we'll have a nice chat about your plans, the older woman added with a meaningful look. I've got some ideas you might find interesting. The meeting at the bank went smoothly. The manager, Mr. Peterson, confirmed that Joseph Hollis had already filed the preliminary paperwork regarding her inheritance. The funds should be released to you within the month, Mrs. Jameson, he explained. In the meantime, considering your circumstances, the bank is prepared to extend you a small line of credit against the anticipated amount. That's very kind, Zoey replied, but unnecessary for now. I'm comfortably situated at Mr. Quinn's ranch. Mr. Peterson's eyebrows rose slightly. Yes, Quinn's place. Modest, but he's built it into a respectable operation. Not many men could have done so much starting with so little. Zoey seized the opening. You've known Mr. Quinn long then? Since he first arrived in Dillon, Peterson confirmed. Hard worker, pays his debts on time. Keeps to himself, though. He hesitated, then added, there was some trouble a few years back with Victor Blackstone. Nothing criminal, mind you, but unfortunate. What kind of trouble? Zoey pressed. Peterson looked uncomfortable. I probably shouldn't say. Bank confidentiality, you understand. Please, Mr. Peterson. Zoey leaned forward earnestly. It's important. The banker's side. Well, I suppose it's common knowledge around town anyway. Blackstone holds the mortgage on the property adjacent to Quinn's ranch, the old Wilson place. prime grazing land with excellent water access. Quinn tried to buy it when old Wilson died, but Blackstone outbid him, then offered to sell it to Quinn at double the price. That seems dishonest, Zoey observed. That's Blackstone's way. Peterson agreed grimly. When Quinn refused, Blackstone threatened to sell to the railroad instead, said they'd run tracks right through, disrupting Quinn's operation. Quinn had to take out a large loan to match Blackstone's new price. Nearly bankrupted him, but he paid it off eventually. I see, Zoey said thoughtfully. And was there ever any violence between them? Peterson looked startled. Violence? No, nothing like that. Quinn's not the type, despite, he stopped abruptly. Despite what? Zoey prompted. The banker cleared his throat awkwardly. Just rumors, Mrs. Jameson. Nothing substantial. Mr. Peterson, Zoey said firmly. I'm considering my future, which may involve Xavier Quinn. If you know something that might affect that decision, I'd consider it a personal favor if you'd share it. Peterson studied her for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. Very well. When Quinn first came to Dillon, there were stories that he was running from something back east. Some said he'd killed a man in Missouri self-defense, the tale went, but he fled rather than face a trial. Others claimed he was escaping gambling debts. Typical frontier gossip, you understand, probably with little basis in fact. But you don't believe that, Zoey guessed, noting his expression. Let's just say I've always found it curious that a man as capable and hard-working as Quinn would end up in a backwater like Dillon, working as a ranch hand, Peterson replied carefully. Men with his qualities usually have bigger ambitions unless something constrains their options. Zoey thanked him for his candor, her mind racing as she left the bank. Xavier a killer? It seemed impossible. The man she knew was gentle with children and animals, honest in his dealings, quick to help those in need. Yet everyone had secrets, as she well knew. Her own marriage had been built on lies and deception. Her next stop was the newspaper office, where she inquired about old editions that might mention Xavier Quinn. The editor, a harried man with ink-stained fingers, directed her to a dusty shelf of bound volumes. Anything in particular you're looking for, madam? He asked. Information about Xavier Quinn, she replied honestly. I understand he came to Dillon about 10 years ago. The editor's expression sharpened with interest. Quinn, eh? Not much in the papers about him, I'm afraid. Keeps to himself, that one. He pulled down a volume. Though there was that business with the Blackstone property about 3 years back. Caused quite a stir. The article he showed her confirmed Peterson's account of the land dispute, though it contained little additional information. As Zoey was about to leave, however, the editor called her back. Just remembered something, he said. Few years ago, got a letter from a newspaper man in Missouri asking if a Xavier Quinn resided in these parts. Said he was researching an old story. Zoey's heart quickened. Did you respond? Wrote back saying yes, but never heard more about it. The editor shrugged. Might be nothing, might be something. Quinn never mentioned it, so I figured it wasn't important. Zoey's final stop was the Silver Dollar Saloon, where she hesitated briefly before entering. It wasn't considered proper for a respectable woman to enter such an establishment, but her need for answers outweighed social conventions. The saloon was relatively quiet at midday, with only a few patrons nursing drinks at scattered tables. The bartender looked up in surprise as she approached. Can I help you, madam? He asked dubiously. I'm looking for Mr. Blackstone, Zoey said firmly. I'm afraid he's not here at present, came a smooth voice from behind her. Zoey turned to find Victor Blackstone descending the stairs from the upper floor, impeccably dressed as before. Though I'm delighted you sought me out, Mrs. Jameson. What can I do for you? I'd like to speak with you privately, Mr. Blackstone, Zoey replied, ignoring the curious stares from the few customers. Blackstone's smile widened. Of course. My office is upstairs. Please, follow me. Against her better judgment, Zoey followed him up the narrow staircase to a surprisingly elegant office overlooking the main street. Blackstone gestured to a leather chair before seating himself behind a massive desk. Now, to what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? He asked, steepling his fingers. I want to know what you know about Xavier Quinn, Zoey said bluntly. Specifically, about his past in Missouri. Blackstone's eyebrows rose. My, direct, aren't we? And why would you think I know anything about Quinn's sordid history? Because you alluded to it when we met. You enjoy having power over people, Mr. Blackstone. Information is power. He laughed, genuine amusement in his eyes. Perceptive as well as beautiful. I begin to see what Quinn sees in you. Leaning forward, he added, but what makes you think I'd share such valuable information freely? Because it costs you nothing and satisfies your desire to cause trouble, Zoey replied steadily. And because I think you enjoy an audience for your machinations. Blackstone studied her for a long moment, then nodded appreciatively. Well reasoned, Mrs. Jameson. Very well, I'll tell you what I know which, I assure you, is considerably more than the good citizens of Dillon have pieced together. He rose, moving to a cabinet from which he extracted a folder. 10 years ago, a man named James Matheson was shot dead in Springfield, Missouri. The accused was one Xavier Quinn, then a young cowhand working at Matheson's ranch. Zoe's breath caught. He killed his employer? So it would seem, Blackstone replied, consulting the papers. Quinn claimed self-defense, said Matheson attacked him in a drunken rage. But there were complications. Matheson's daughter was involved somehow. The details are murky, but there was talk of inappropriate relations. Quinn fled before the trial, becoming effectively a fugitive. You're suggesting Xavier and this man's daughter. Zoey couldn't finish the sentence. Blackstone shrugged. The girl was 16 at the time. Young, but not scandalously so by frontier standards. Whether their relationship was consensual or coerced, I couldn't say. The fact remains, Quinn killed her father and ran rather than face justice. Zoe's mind was reeling. Could this be the secret Xavier had been so reluctant to share? If so, she could understand his hesitation and his fear that it would change her opinion of him. How did you come by this information? She asked. Blackstone smiled thinly. I make it my business to know the vulnerabilities of those around me, Mrs. Jameson. It's proven useful in my dealings with Quinn over the years. You've been blackmailing him, Zoey realized with growing anger. Such an ugly word, Blackstone demurred. Let's say I've ensured his cooperation in certain business matters. He leaned forward. I could do the same for you, you know. I understand you've come into a significant inheritance. I have several investment opportunities that could double your money within a year. Zoey stood abruptly. Thank you for the information, Mr. Blackstone. I'll be going now. One moment, Mrs. Jameson, he called as she reached the door. A word of advice, if I may. Men like Quinn don't change their fundamental nature. If violence and deception marked his past, they'll surface again eventually. Better to align yourself with someone of established position and means. Someone like you? Zoey asked coldly. Blackstone spread his hands. I'm merely suggesting you consider all your options before tying yourself to a man with such baggage. Good day, Mr. Blackstone, Zoey said firmly, closing the door behind her. By the time she returned to Mrs. Hollis's house, Zoe's mind was in turmoil. The pieces of Xavier's past that she had gathered painted a troubling picture, yet somehow incomplete. She found it difficult to reconcile the violent fugitive Blackstone described with the honorable, gentle man she had come to love. Mrs. Hollis greeted her with tea and fresh-baked cookies, Thomas contentedly playing with a wooden spoon at her feet. You look positively exhausted, dear, the older woman observed. Was the banking business so taxing? It wasn't just the bank, Zoey admitted. I've been making inquiries about Xavier. Mrs. Hollis's expression grew serious. I see. And did you find what you were looking for? I'm not sure, Zoey confessed. I heard disturbing things. That he killed a man in Missouri. That he fled to avoid trial. Mrs. Hollis sighed deeply. Yes, those rumors have circulated for years. Though I must say, they've never quite aligned with the Xavier Quinn I've known, a man who once rode 15 miles in a blizzard to bring medicine to old Pete's sister when she had pneumonia. You don't believe the stories. I believe there's always more to a story than what gossips tell, Mrs. Hollis replied thoughtfully. And I believe a person should be judged by their actions over time, not by one moment of their past. She patted Zoe's hand. The real question, my dear, is what do you believe? I believe I need to hear Xavier's side of the story, Zoey said firmly. The full truth, not rumors or accusations. Mrs. Hollis nodded approvingly. Then I suggest you ask him directly, without judgment. In my experience, most men will tell the truth if they believe they'll get a fair hearing. When Xavier arrived to collect her at 4 o'clock, Zoey was ready. She thanked Mrs. Hollis warmly for her hospitality and advice, promising to visit again soon. The ride back to the ranch was initially as silent as the morning journey had been, but as they passed the town limits, Zoey gathered her courage. "I know about Missouri," she said quietly. "About James Matheson." Xavier's hands tightened on the reins, but he kept his eyes on the road. "Blackstone," he said flatly. "I should have known he'd find a way to poison you against me." "No one has poisoned me against you," Zoey countered. "I simply want to hear the truth from you." For several long moments, Xavier was silent. The only sounds the creaking of the wagon and the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves on the dusty road. "Yes, I killed James Matheson," he finally said, his voice low and controlled. "And yes, I ran rather than face trial." But it wasn't how Blackstone surely painted it. "Then tell me how it was," Zoey urged gently. Xavier drew a deep breath. "I was 22, working as a hand on Matheson's ranch outside Springfield. His daughter, Sarah, was 17, not 16, as I'm sure Blackstone claimed. She was a sweet girl, kind to everyone. We became friends, more than friends." Zoey asked carefully. "Eventually, yes," Xavier admitted. "We were discreet, but her father found out. He was a violent man when drunk, which was often. He'd already run off 2 hands that spring with his temper." "What happened the night he died?" "He caught Sarah sneaking back to the house after we'd met in the barn, dragged her inside by her hair, beating her as he went. I heard her screams and ran to help." Xavier's jaw tightened at the memory. "When I burst in, he had her pinned to the floor, his belt raised. I pulled him off her, told her to run. He came at me with a knife from the table." "Self-defense," Zoey murmured. "That's how I saw it," Xavier agreed grimly. "But Matheson had powerful friends in town. The sheriff, his brother-in-law, made it clear I wouldn't get a fair trial. Said I'd hang for sure, that they'd paint me as a predator who'd taken advantage of an innocent girl, then murdered her father when confronted. So you ran." "Sarah begged me to," he said softly. "Said she couldn't bear to watch me hang for protecting her. She had an aunt in St. Louis she could go to. We agreed to meet there in a month, after the initial search died down." "But you never did," Zoey guessed, seeing the pain in his eyes. Xavier shook his head. "I tried, but by the time I got to St. Louis, she'd died of typhoid fever. Her aunt told me Sarah had spoken of me, had asked her to tell me she loved me if I ever came looking." His voice broke slightly. "I'd failed to protect her in the end." "Oh, Xavier," Zoey breathed, her heart aching for the young man he'd been, for the guilt he'd carried all these years. "After that, I just kept moving west. Changed my name slightly. It was originally Quint, not Quinn. Worked where I could, kept to myself. Eventually ended up in Dillon. And Blackstone discovered your past." Xavier nodded grimly. "About 5 years ago. Used it to pressure me into selling him water rights I didn't want to part with. Threatened to contact the Missouri authorities if I refused. But surely after all this time, with Matheson's daughter and likely many of the witnesses dead. Maybe," Xavier conceded. "But the risk was too great. I'd built something here, something honest. I couldn't bear to lose it, to be dragged back to Missouri in chains." They had reached the ranch, the familiar buildings golden in the late afternoon sunlight. Xavier halted the wagon before the cabin, but made no move to help Zoey down. "Now you know everything," he said quietly. "I'll understand if you want to leave. Mrs. Hollis would be happy to have you stay with her until you decide what to do with your inheritance. Is that what you want?" Zoey asked. "For me to leave?" Xavier finally looked at her, his blue eyes troubled. "What I want stopped mattering a long time ago, Zoey. It's what's best for you and Thomas that counts now. And you think being away from you is what's best for us." "I'm a wanted man," he said bleakly. "Maybe not actively hunted anymore, but the charges still stand. One letter from Blackstone to the Missouri authorities, and everything I've built here could crumble. Is that the kind of instability you want for Thomas? The kind of man you want in your life?" "The kind of man I want," Zoey said carefully, "is one who would risk his life to protect a young woman from abuse. One who would build an honest life despite past troubles. One who would take in a desperate mother and child during a storm, asking nothing in return." She reached out, covering his hand with hers. "That's the man you are, Xavier Quinn. Not the man Blackstone or the gossips paint you to be." Hope flickered in his eyes, quickly suppressed. "You can't know what you're saying, Zoey. The risks, I know exactly what I'm saying." she interrupted firmly. I've spent my life being careful, making the safe choice, and look where it led me. Married to a con man who abandoned me and his child without a second thought. She squeezed his hand. I'm tired of living in fear, Xavier. Aren't you? For a long moment, he stared at her, searching her face as if for any sign of doubt or deception. Then, with a sound that was half laugh, half sob, he pulled her into his arms. God help me. I am, he whispered against her hair. I've wanted to tell you how I feel for so long, but I was afraid you'd leave, afraid Blackstone would use you to get to me, afraid of hoping for something I don't deserve. Zoe drew back just enough to look into his face. Tell me now, she urged softly. I love you, Zoey Jameson, Xavier said simply. You and Thomas both. When I found you in that storm, I never imagined you'd come to mean everything to me. I want you to stay not as my housekeeper, but as my wife, if you'll have me. In answer, Zoe leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, then deepened as Xavier's arms tightened around her, drawing her closer. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. I'll take that as a yes, Xavier said, a smile spreading across his face, the first true, unguarded smile Zoe had seen from him. It's a yes, she confirmed, her own smile radiant. But there's one condition. Name it, he said immediately. We deal with Blackstone. I won't have him hanging this over our heads forever. There must be a way to resolve your past once and for all. Xavier's expression sobered. It's a risk, Zoe. A big one. Some risks are worth taking, she countered. And we'll face it together. As Thomas began to fuss from his basket in the wagon, demanding attention, Xavier helped Zoe down and lifted the baby into his arms. The child immediately quieted, regarding Xavier with solemn eyes before breaking into a toothless grin. See, Zoe said softly. Even Thomas agrees. Xavier looked from the child to the woman before him, wonder in his eyes. How did I get so lucky, he murmured. It wasn't luck, Zoe replied, linking her arm through his as they walked toward the cabin their home. It was that storm, and your choice that day. We stay, you said. And here we are. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity and planning. With Zoe's encouragement, Xavier wrote to a lawyer in Missouri, explaining the circumstances of James Matheson's death and inquiring about the status of the charges against him. While awaiting a response, they continued to improve the ranch, now with a shared vision of its future. Zoe's inheritance arrived as promised, deposited in the Dillon Bank in her name. Rather than moving to town as many had expected, she used a portion of the money to order supplies for expanding the ranch house, adding a proper kitchen, a second bedroom for Thomas, and a small parlor where they could receive guests. Are you sure about this? Xavier asked as they reviewed the plans together one evening. It's your money, Zoe. You could do anything with it: buy a house in town, start a business, even move to a bigger city. I'm investing in our future, she replied firmly. Besides, I still have plenty set aside for Thomas's education and emergencies. She smiled mischievously. And I've ordered a proper wedding dress from Denver. Mrs. Hollis is beside herself with excitement about the wedding. Xavier pulled her into his arms, still marveling at his good fortune. I still can't believe you chose this life, chose me, when you could have had so much more. I chose exactly what I wanted, Zoe assured him, rising on tiptoes to kiss him softly. A home, a purpose, and a man who loves me for who I am. Their wedding was set for September, a small affair with only a few guests from town: Mrs. Hollis and her nephew Joseph, Mr. Peterson and his wife, Old Pete and his sister, and a few neighboring ranchers with whom Xavier had formed friendships over the years. 2 weeks before the ceremony, a letter arrived from Missouri. Xavier's hands trembled as he broke the seal, Zoe standing anxiously at his shoulder as he read. What does it say? She asked when he remained silent for several long moments. Xavier looked up, his expression stunned. The charges were dropped, he said incredulously. Years ago, apparently. Sarah's aunt testified before she died that Matheson had been abusive to both his daughter and his wife before her death. Several ranch hands came forward with similar accounts after the initial furor died down. He shook his head in disbelief. All this time, I've been running from nothing. Oh, Xavier, Zoe breathed, relief washing over her. This is wonderful news. There's more, he said, scanning the rest of the letter. The lawyer says there might even be a small inheritance waiting for me. Sarah's aunt apparently left her estate to be divided between her blood relatives and the young man who tried to save my niece from her father's cruelty, if he can be located. Tears of joy sprang to Zoe's eyes. You see, justice finds its way eventually. Xavier pulled her into a fierce embrace. It found its way to me the day I found you in the rain, he murmured against her hair. With the shadow of his past finally lifted, Xavier rode into town the next day to confront Victor Blackstone. He found the saloon owner in his office. As usual, though he seemed less composed than normal when Xavier entered unannounced. Quinn, Blackstone greeted him, recovering quickly. To what do I owe this unexpected visit? Come to beg me not to reveal your sordid past to your bride-to-be? I'm afraid you're too late for that. I know you spoke to Zoe, Xavier said calmly. But your information was incomplete, Blackstone. The charges against me in Missouri were dropped years ago. He placed the lawyer's letter on the desk, watching as Blackstone scanned it with increasing disbelief. Impossible, the saloon owner muttered. My sources were clearly not as thorough as they claimed to be, Xavier finished for him. Your leverage is gone, Blackstone. You have nothing to hold over me anymore. Blackstone's face hardened. Don't be so sure, Quinn. A man in my position has many ways to make life difficult for those who cross him. Is that a threat? Xavier asked quietly. A reminder, Blackstone replied, leaning back in his chair. This town runs on my goodwill. The mortgage on your ranch, the contracts for your cattle all can be affected by a word from me to the right people. Xavier smiled, a cold expression that made Blackstone shift uncomfortably. I anticipated you might say something like that, he said, extracting another document from his coat. This is a statement I've prepared detailing your attempts at extortion over the years, including your use of false information about my past to pressure me into unfavorable business dealings. It's been witnessed by Mr. Peterson of the bank and Joseph Hollis of the Rocky Mountain Detective Agency. Blackstone's face had gone pale. You wouldn't dare. I've already sent copies to the territorial governor's office and the federal marshal, Xavier continued calmly. I'm told they're quite interested in investigating corruption in frontier towns these days. Rising from his chair, Xavier leaned forward, placing his hands on Blackstone's desk. Here's how this will work. You'll leave me, my soon-to-be wife, and our business affairs alone. In return, I won't actively pursue the investigation. You continue your operations in Dillon. I continue mine on my ranch, and we have as little to do with each other as possible. Are we clear? Blackstone stared at him for a long moment, calculation in his eyes. Finally, he nodded stiffly. Crystal clear, Quinn. Though I never took you for the vengeful type. I'm not seeking vengeance, Xavier replied, straightening. Just peace for my family. Good day, Blackstone. As he walked out of the Silver Dollar Saloon for what he hoped would be the last time, Xavier felt lighter than he had in years. With his past resolved and Blackstone neutralized, the future stretched before him bright with possibility. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the Wyoming landscape ablaze with autumn colors. In the yard of their expanded ranch house, beneath an arch of late-blooming wildflowers, Xavier waited nervously for his bride to appear. Old Pete stood beside him as best man, grinning broadly beneath his grizzled mustache. Never thought I'd see this day, he chuckled. The boss hitched at last. Neither did I, Xavier admitted, adjusting his new suit jacket self-consciously. The small gathering of guests fell silent as Zoe appeared in the doorway of the house, Mrs. Hollis behind her holding Thomas, who was dressed in a miniature suit that matched Xavier's. Zoe's dress was simple but elegant cream-colored silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, her copper hair swept up with sprigs of white flowers. As she walked toward him, Xavier felt his heart might burst with love and gratitude. This woman, this strong, intelligent, compassionate woman had saved him in every way a person could be saved. She had given him a family, a future, and most precious of all, her trust and love despite knowing his darkest secrets. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, their vows spoken clearly for all to hear. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed Zoe with a tenderness that brought tears to more than one observer's eyes. The celebration afterward was joyful, with food and music and even dancing on the new wooden floor of their expanded parlor. As evening fell, Lanterns were lit around the yard, casting a golden glow over the gathering. "Happy, Mrs. Quinn?" Xavier asked softly as they swayed together to the fiddle music provided by one of the neighboring ranchers. Deliriously, Zoe confirmed, her eyes shining. "And you, Mr. Quinn? Any regrets about taking in a woman and child during that storm?" "Only that I didn't find you sooner," he replied, pulling her closer. "Though I reckon things happen when they're meant to." Later, after their guests had departed and Thomas was peacefully asleep in his new room, Xavier and Zoe stood on the porch of their home, gazing up at the star-filled Wyoming sky. "I've been thinking," Xavier said, his arm around his wife's waist. "With your inheritance and the money from Sarah's aunt's estate, we could expand the ranch even more. Maybe specialize in breeding horses rather than just cattle. I've always had a knack with them." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Zoe agreed. "And perhaps, once Thomas is a bit older, we might consider adding to our family. I always wanted a large family growing up." Xavier turned to face her, his eyes filled with emotion. "Nothing would make me happier," he said softly. "I love you, Zoey Quinn. More than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "My cowboy who stayed." As they sealed their plans with a kiss, a soft rain began to fall, pattering gently on the roof above them. But unlike that fateful day months ago when Xavier had found a desperate woman and crying child in the rain, this shower brought no sorrow, no fear, only the promise of renewal and growth for the life they were building together. 5 years later, the Quinn Ranch had flourished beyond even Xavier's ambitious dreams. The horse breeding operation had proven remarkably successful, with buyers coming from as far as Denver and San Francisco to purchase their stock. The original cabin had been incorporated into a sprawling ranch house that, while still modest by some standards, offered ample room for their growing family. Thomas, now 5.5, was a bright, curious boy who shadowed Xavier everywhere, soaking up knowledge about horses and ranch life with remarkable aptitude. He was joined by 3-year-old Sarah, named for the girl Xavier had tried to save in his youth, and 1-year-old Michael, both of whom had their mother's copper hair and their father's blue eyes. On a warm June evening, the family gathered on the wide porch that now wrapped around 3 sides of the house. Zoe sat in a rocking chair nursing baby Michael, while Xavier helped Thomas and Sarah build a precarious tower of wooden blocks on the plank floor. "Higher, Papa, higher," Sarah demanded, her small face serious with concentration. "Any higher, and it'll topple for sure, little one," Xavier warned with a chuckle, though he carefully placed another block as instructed. "Remember when this was just a one-room cabin?" Zoe mused, looking around at their expanded home and the well-maintained ranch buildings beyond. "I could hardly imagine building a life here then." "And now?" Xavier asked, glancing up at his wife with the same adoration that had only deepened over the years. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else," she replied simply. As if on cue, the tower of blocks collapsed, sending Sarah into peals of laughter and Thomas into determined reconstruction efforts. "I got a letter from Joseph Hollis today," Xavier mentioned as he helped the children gather the scattered blocks. "He's been promoted to chief investigator for the Rocky Mountain Detective Agency." "That's wonderful," Zoe said. "And how are things in Dillon? Any news of Blackstone?" Xavier shook his head. "Apparently he sold the Silver Dollar last month, packed up, and headed to California. Rumor has it he ran into some trouble with the territorial authorities, something about unpaid taxes." "Can't say I'm sorry to hear it," Zoe remarked. "Though I suppose in a way, we owe him something. If he hadn't tried to use your past against you, we might never have resolved it." "True enough," Xavier agreed. "Though I prefer to think it was Providence that brought us together, not Victor Blackstone's schemes." "Papa, tell us the story again," Thomas requested, abandoning the blocks to climb into his father's lap. "About how you found Mama in the rain." "Yes, please," Sarah echoed, snuggling against Xavier's side. Xavier and Zoe exchanged fond glances. The children never tired of hearing the tale, though they told a gentler version than the desperate reality had been. "Well," Xavier began, his deep voice taking on the storytelling cadence the children loved, "it was a dark and stormy day, much like the one when we found that stray kitten last spring. I was riding home, thinking about nothing much at all, when I saw something strange beneath a big old tree by the road. It was Mama, Sarah interjected excitedly. Indeed it was, Xavier confirmed. Your mama, looking like a half-drowned angel, with baby Thomas crying in her arms. And do you know what I said when I saw them? We stay. The children chorused, having heard the story many times before. That's right, Xavier said softly, his eyes meeting Zoe's across the porch. We stay. And we did, Zoe added, her voice warm with contentment. And we always will. As the sun set over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose, the Quinn family remained on their porch, surrounded by the life they had built together, a life born from a chance encounter in the rain, nurtured by courage and trust, and flourishing in the fertile soil of love and commitment. For Xavier and Zoey Quinn, the journey that had begun with two simple words, we stay, had led to a destination neither could have imagined on that stormy day 5 years ago, a home filled with laughter, a ranch prospering through honest work, and a love that, like the land itself, only grew stronger with each passing season. And as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Xavier pulled his wife and children close, grateful beyond words for the storm that had brought them together and the courage they had found to weather all that followed together.